This video is part of a series of SSIS tutorial videos created by COZYROC. In this video, I will show you how to configure a package that logs the names of files when it loads the records from the files into a table. Then I'll show you how to check the log to determine whether or not a file has been loaded already and take appropriate action depending on the result. I have two Excel files in this folder right now, and I'm going to be reading in the rows from these files and writing them to a single SQL Server table. There you can see we have a lot of columns and 13 rows, and both files have the same columns in them. And here we are in Visual Studio, and I've already configured a package that simply loops through the files in that folder and reads the records and writes them to the SQL Server table. And I'm going to be making some changes to this because we want to keep track of each Excel file when we're processing it. We want to log information about it so that when we go and look in that folder for any new files, we can tell which ones have already been loaded and which ones have not. And before I show you around in the package, I want to show you I have three variables set up. One is for the file name, which of course the Foreach loop container will fill that variable in with the file that's currently being processed. And then loaded already, I'll explain what that's for when I get to the point where I'm using it. And then the record count, when we go through each file and process it, we'll just count the number of records that we wrote into the SQL table. So here's my Foreach loop container. And we've set up the collection to use Foreach file enumerator. And then here we go to that folder that I just showed you where the Excel files are. And then we said, yeah, just read in Excel files from there. And we only want the name in our file name variable. This is where we tell it what variable to use to put the file name into as it goes through each of the files in the folder. And then we have a data flow task, which has an Excel source component that just reads in the data from each of the files in the folder as we go through the Foreach loop container. And then here's how we count the rows. It's a very simple setup. Here we just put in the variable where we want the row count to be maintained. And then we have the OLEDB destination. And that's just going to write the data to a table, which I will show you right now. I'm going to go over to Management Studio and show you the two tables that we'll be using. So that OLEDB destination will be writing the data to this table. You can see it's empty there, and it has all the same column names as the Excel files have. And then this is a table that we're going to be using in a little bit. This is how we're going to keep track of the files that we've already loaded the data from. So another thing I needed to do was to go into the properties for the Excel Connection Manager. And because we're going to be processing, of course, multiple files, we had to set up an expression right here. You can see the Excel file path for the first file in that folder. But we want it to change, of course, with each loop through the Foreach loop container. So we set up an expression to use the variable called file name. And there you can see it evaluates correctly. And it'll change each time through the loop. Right, so we'll go back over to the control flow. I'll just go ahead and execute the package the way it is. And it was successful. I'll stop debugging and we'll go over to Management Studio. And we'll look at the gaming data table now, which is our common table that we're loading all the files into. So it works to just load up those two files, the data from those two files. So I'm going to clear out that table, and there's nothing in the tracking table yet because we haven't started logging any information at this point. So now we're going to add an execute SQL task inside the Foreach loop container after our data flow task. And we're going to use this to log file name, record count, and date. All right, so I double click to open that task, and we'll choose our existing OLEDB connection manager because the tracking table is in the same database as the table for the gaming data. Result set is none. SQL source type will be direct input. And here we'll configure our SQL statement. I'm going to go over to Management Studio, and what we want to log about our files is something like this. So the first column will just say loaded. The second column will have the actual file name. The third column will have the record count, and the fourth column will have the date, current date and time at the time that it logged this row. So we're going to use a statement, an insert statement that looks like this, pretty much. Back over to Visual Studio, paste this in here, but we have to use question marks for parameters. So we take out the hard-coded values and put in a question mark. Whoops. And click OK. And then we need to map the parameters. So we have to tell it what to put in those two question marks. So I'm going to add a row, and gotta go down and find file name variable, and the direction is input. So we'll be providing the input to put into that statement. The data type will be varchar right there. And then for parameters, since we're using OLEDB, would be just 0 because that's the first question mark. And then we're going to add another row for the record count. So we choose that variable. Again, we're providing input for the statement. I'm going to change this to short. Oh, there it is. And then this is the second parameter, so that'll be 1. So it numbers the parameters starting with 0. And then we can close that. So that should be ready to go. So I'll run the package again, and we still just have the two files in that folder. But now it's going to actually log that it copied over the data from those two files, and it'll log it in the tracking table. All right, we'll stop debugging. We'll go to Management Studio, and we're going to take a look at the tracking table here. So there you can see our columns actually have names now: status, file name, record count, and date. And there you can see it logged that it loaded the data from file 1 and file 2, and it also provides the record count and the date for the time that it processed those files. So we can also look at the gaming table. It loaded 23 rows, and that is the correct number from the two files. Stay tuned to see how I check the tracking table to determine if a file has been loaded yet, and only load it if it has not been loaded.
Are you tired of updating packages because of changing metadata? How many hours have you spent accommodating new source and destination columns? How many nearly identical packages do you have to maintain? Especially when you need to update hundreds of them. Well, you should check out COZYROC's Data Flow Task Plus component. Dataflow Task Plus provides the ability to acquire the metadata and map the columns at runtime. You can even use transformations on the data. Just add the changes at the source and destination, execute, and Dataflow Task Plus will handle the process of extracting, transforming, and loading the desired columns from the source to the destination, without a need to change the existing package. It works with any standard SSIS Dataflow components, transformations, and application adapters. No more manual package updates. Design your SSIS data flows with Dataflow Task Plus and save hundreds of hours. A vision of completely metadata-driven processing is now possible. Download COZYROC's Dataflow Task Plus from COZYROC.com. It's free for testing and development within Visual Studio.
Now back over in Visual Studio, I'm going to use execute SQL task again, but this time I'm using it before the data flow task, although it is still inside the Foreach loop container. And this time we're using it to check if file already loaded. All right, so I double click to open the editor, and we're going to actually check for the file name in the tracking table. So we'll have a result that tells us whether it shows up at all in the tracking table based on the file name. And we'll use the same connection again. It's in the same database. And we'll use direct input. Now we need to set up our SQL query. And we'll go back over to Management Studio. And we want to do something that looks like this. So it says, give me the count of the number of times that file 3 shows up in this table. Of course, we didn't load a file 3, so that's 0. But if I put it to file 2, which was loaded, it gives us a count of 1. So let's copy this and go back to Visual Studio. We'll paste this in, and again, in place of a hard-coded file name, we'll put a question mark for a parameter. And of course, this is still going to return a result set of a single row. But right now we're working on the parameter. So we'll go over to parameter mapping, and we'll add a row. And we need to use the file name variable again. And the direction again is input. So we're providing the file name as input to that statement that we want to use. It's still an nvar_char. And it's the first and only question mark, so it's the first parameter, which we start numbering with 0. Now we also need to set up the result set, which is where it's going to give us the count, which should only ever be 0 or 1. We'll get a 0 back if the file has not been loaded yet, and we'll get a 1 if the data from the file has been loaded. So since we said to put the count in a column named CNT with our statement, we're going to have the result name be CNT, and then the variable that it'll put it in is the loaded already variable. So that'll either be 0 or 1. And again, just to show you where our CNT came from, let's go back to the General tab, and there you can see we have the count as CNT. So that's why we used CNT for that result name. All right, we have to connect the arrow here. So we need to set up a constraint. So I right mouse clicked on the arrow there, go to edit, going to use a constraint and expression. We want, if it's successful, meaning our expression is going to use the loaded already variable. So if that is equal to 0, which right now is true, then we're going to go on and do the rest of the tasks in the Foreach loop container. Otherwise, it's not going to go on and do the rest of the tasks, and it'll just go back and loop through another time, look for another file to process. I've added 3 more files to the folder that we'll be looping through, so now we'll execute the package again. So I'll stop debugging and we'll go over to Management Studio. And now we expect to see files 1 through 5 only once in this tracking table, and that's what we see. So it did not reload file 1 and file 2, but it did load file 3, 4, and 5. And if we look at the data in our gaming data table, see, we now have 80 rows, which is the correct number for all 5 files. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to follow us on social media, here's how you can do that.